Hello, welcome to this first English episode of Our Two Cents. I'm gonna be speaking with the Frenchies for like 5 seconds. Les Français, aujourd'hui, c'est un épisode en anglais parce qu'il y a des gens dans ma vie qui sont passionnants, intéressants et que j'avais envie d'interviewer, mais qui parlent anglais. Du coup, c'est un épisode en anglais. Désolée si vous ne comprenez pas. So, we are speaking about reading with Katie. And this is a really interesting subject because we talk about how reading is affecting the way we see society and people in the society. And so, yeah, it's really interesting, and we share about, well, Katie shares about some sociological stuff, and I say the word like a really high number of times, and I'm sorry about this. I need to get better at learning new words. New vocabulary to know how to express my thoughts. So this was a really cool episode and I hope you will like it. And yeah, okay, so now we are supposed to, I'm glad that I'm doing this with you because I don't know how to start an episode without saying welcome to the Our Two Cents.
Our 2 cents.
Yes, Katie, thanks for this new jingle. This is great. Like, this brings a bit of music into this episode.
Yep, I'm starting a new career as a jingle writer.
Oh, nice. I love this.
My thing now.
Right. So, Katie, I know you, but people don't know you. And you're our first guest that I interview in English. So, who are you, Katie?
Wow, I thought you were going to start with an easy question. Who am I?
Yeah.
I'm Katie. I'm originally from the US, and I am on this podcast because I am married to Sophie's brother. I am also an older sister and a reader and a creative writer and a jingle writer now.
This is, that's great. So you are a reader. What do you read at the moment?
I especially like reading science fiction and fantasy and young adult fiction, anything with a sort of speculative element. So even sort of sci-fi or fantasy stuff that's mostly real life, but just has one thing that's different from our world. And sometimes literary fiction if it's not too boring.
What is literary fiction?
Oh, that would be like the kind of books that you would have to read in school.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have an example of a book you had to read in school that you liked?
Yes, I enjoyed reading To Kill a Mockingbird in our American Lit class.
Yeah, nice.
It was a pretty good
I was like, I'm not sure we ever read the same book while growing up, but I read To Kill a Mockingbird. Mockingbird.
Cool.
Mockingbird. That's a different novel. Okay, nice. Anyway, so this podcast episode is called Reading the Other. And when we talked about what subject we could have for the podcast, you explained to me what the other is. And can you explain it to people who are listening now?
Yes. So the other is a concept or a term usually used in like philosophy or psychology just to refer to those who aren't yourself. So there's the self and there's the other. So it's people that aren't you, or especially people that aren't in your group. So I heard this concept first when we were talking about ethics in some research that I was doing in college. And in that context, the other was the basis for ethics because our way of deciding what is ethical or not is what is our responsibility to the other and what is our responsibility to people who are outside of our group or whose needs and desires we don't automatically think about.
Wow, this is great. Thanks. And like, if we talk about like the Bible and who is my neighbor, a question that people ask to Jesus, who is my neighbor? And like the other can be my neighbor.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way of thinking about who is my neighbor. Your neighbor is anyone who isn't yourself on some level. And I especially like thinking about the concept of the other when I'm thinking about reading and also when I'm thinking about writing, because I like to do creative writing, in that good writing can help you identify with people that aren't like you. And a well-crafted story can give you a connection to the other. And bad writing doesn't do that. It doesn't treat others as whole or complex people, or it just uses them as a trope and doesn't give them a full complex personhood.
Wow, interesting. I love this. This is, it just makes people simplified. Yeah. Wow, bad writing does that. And good writing makes you ponder like how you view the other and your prejudice against someone you don't know.
Right. Or also to see what could the motivations for someone who acts differently from me, what are their motivations, and can I relate to those motivations as a fellow human or as a fellow person? Because sometimes in books they aren't necessarily human, but as a person, can I understand their motivations? Has it been written in a way that I can understand why they're doing what they're doing? And is that does that compel me to have empathy for them?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I'm thinking of the word they, like they are doing this when you read the sometimes different newspaper, and they is always like a group of people that we don't have empathy for. And I think this is dehumanizing. How do you say this word?
Dehumanizing?
Yes, that if we call the other they. Of course, sometimes we need to use that word, but most of the time it's because it's simplistic to use only they and not to, but like to think deeply of who they are.
Yeah.
Nice. It's really interesting. Like I remember in the TV show on Netflix, The Good Place. Have you watched it?
Yes.
At one point they talk about a book, a fictional book that is called What We Owe Each Other. And I wonder what the other is in each other.
Yeah, that was the one that... Shoot. It's fictional? I thought that was one of the actual works that they were talking about having been
Maybe,
written.
but I remember that they, like Chidi, he's doing a talk, and he did a YouTube TED Talk or something called What We Owe Each Other. And that's how Eleanor finds him again.
Okay.
Sorry about the big spoiler if you didn't watch this show, but it's been like 4 years or something since
You should have watched it
aired. So yeah, you should have watched it. But now it's like I spoiled Titanic or something.
I don't think we've given that major spoilers yet, but what we owe each other is, I can't remember exactly what his point is, but it sounds similar to how I was introduced to the concept of the other, which was in reference to the works of Emmanuel Levinas, who talked about the other having a sense of the existence of the other, of someone outside of ourselves, calls us to a responsibility toward them in some way. So because there are people outside of my family, society has to be organized in a certain way to accommodate all of these people being able to get what they need and being able to live, and the fact that there are people beyond me means that I have to live in such a way that is accommodating to other people's thriving. So I can't eat all the things because there's a second person in my house who has to eat too, or I can't just throw my trash everywhere because there are other people who exist in the same place and who are affected if I leave trash somewhere. And I can't just say, oh, the train system isn't important to me and so I don't want to pay taxes to pay for, this or that I don't use. But because there are other people besides me in society who use those things, and because we've decided that those things like school, like public transportation, like healthcare, just because I'm not sick right now doesn't mean that I don't want there to be a healthcare system. So the idea that there are people beyond me, and there are people beyond my group, beyond my family, beyond people of the same faith as me, society needs to be able to accommodate those people as well. And so the ethical decisions that we make need to be made with other people in mind. And we need to be constantly asking ourselves, who are we forgetting about? And who are we leaving out of the discussion?
I love this. Like, I have a clarification question. Like, the other is you can call the other only the people you're aware of their existence.
That's
Or
also a great question.
if you're not aware, like there are people struggling in your in France, I don't know if like, there's so many different communities that are also that got kicked out of their own countries and they are in France, and if you're not aware of them, are they called the other for you, or they are not called because they don't exist in your mind?
I think that's part of the conceptualization of the other, is the idea that because other people are outside of the self or the in-group for me as a person, that I have to constantly be asking if they exist. And or maybe not constantly, but if we're making important decisions, if we're making laws, if we're making big changes or setting up society in a certain way, then we need to think of who are the people that aren't here at the table making those decisions, or who are the people that we haven't thought about, who are the people who can't be here because they're ill, or because they have a disability, or because they don't speak the same language, or because they don't have documentation. Yeah, I think that the fact or the idea of the other is a push to say, you need to constantly be remembering that there are people that you don't necessarily think about all the time. So asylum seekers, if that isn't something that you're regularly thinking about, they definitely count as the other. And so do people who are in other marginalized groups, especially.
And I'm thinking for a long time in your life, French people were the other for you, or were they non-existent? And then at one point, French people became your family, part of your family. And so I find it really beautiful to say that if you leave space for the other in your life, then they can become your friends and your family. But if you are not aware of their existence, and if you don't care, then you will miss out on having a more rich relation life. And that's cool.
Yeah.
I just bragged about French people. That's fine. Okay, anyway, I'm glad you were the other. Maybe not having a US woman in my family is pretty cool, and I'm glad that the other, that I get to know the other as a person in you. So let's get more into how is reading helping you better understand the other that are not part of your social group. Do you have a book that influenced and shaped how you viewed the other that you read in the last years?
Yeah, I've been trying to intentionally read more books by authors of color, whether that's African Americans or Asian Americans, or even just not people from the US as well. And a couple books that I've read recently that helped me to understand a different perspective from my own was The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. And it's a young adult book, and it's been translated into French. I think I reread it in French when I was taking French classes, just to practice my French with a book that I already knew. But it's the story of a Black teenage girl in the US who lives in a sort of ghetto neighborhood, and her childhood best friend, is killed by the police early on in the book, so I'm not spoiling too much. And it's about how she deals with being a witness to that, also how she deals with being in a neighborhood that has gun violence affecting them, and going to a majority white school, and how that affects her processing of what's going on, and also how her whole neighborhood reacts when the police officer who kills her friend is ultimately acquitted and isn't charged with a crime. And that is a fictionalization of a story that keeps happening in the States. And I knew, in my head, that this is a thing that happens, that it's happened several times just in the last 5 or 6 years, that there have been unarmed Black men killed by police or in violent confrontations with other people, that the people who kill them aren't even charged with a crime, and where there have been protests this happened again. The book was written, I believe, in 2017 or 2018.
Okay.
And so it was after this had happened in the case of Michael Brown, and there were uprisings in Ferguson, Missouri. And this happened again last year. And people will be familiar with the case of George Floyd and with the Black Lives Matter protests in the past few years. But being able to read this book gave that humanization to the characters that you don't necessarily get just from watching the news. And it gave you an inside perspective of, this is a teenage girl. What is she going through every day? What are the things that give her joy even in the middle of these tough circumstances? And what are the specific problems and pitfalls that are happening around this scenario and in this situation? And it was, I really appreciated it because it was giving a new life and personalization to that familiar scenario in a way that I, as a white woman, could connect with without having to sit down with a friend and make them tell me their stories of being pulled over by the police or something like that.
And then if you get to have a conversation with a friend who got pulled over, you can be more present to them because you got like confronted to the harshness, the injustice of it first before, and so you don't have to like handle all of this, and you can be more present with your friend and more like understand more or better or wow, that's interesting. And that's, I think, what makes reading more powerful than watching a movie or something is because it takes longer, and I feel like you have to really sit with the emotion that with the characters. I think for me in a deeper way than when I'm watching a movie, because it takes more adaptability and more like analysis than a movie.
I think that depends also on the writing of the movie. And like Tim and I watched a show that's 5 seasons long that also talks a lot about the war on drugs, the police system, and the racial divide in the city of Baltimore. It's a show called The Wire. And so that show was able to unpack more slowly the way that a book would. But a movie in 2 hours, you're telling a way shorter story than what you can tell in a book. So that's definitely a difference.
And you will understand it, except if it's a how do you say this? Film d'auteur, author movie? Is that a word in English? This is
like a biography, like a biopic?
No, it's like a movie that is really slow and not a lot of things are happening, and it's kind of weird, and like lots of French movies are like this. No, it's like a movie like Tree of Life kind of vibe.
Never watched it.
That's not my kind of movie at all, but like it makes you think and dive deep into what you feel, and you have more space to think than when there's a lot of things happening in the movie. But okay, that's good to know that some TV shows can also have this interiority for the viewers.
That contemplation.
So you are trying to read different books by different author. So this is something that changed maybe in the last 10 years in how you read. But is there any other way that your reading changed since you were a kid? And why?
Yes. So when I was a kid, I think I had this idea that there were just certain books that you had to read, that like I was a very, I don't know if overachieving is the right word, but I was a big reader, and I kind of wanted to read above my level. I don't know if that was to impress my teachers or what, but
to be different.
Yeah, possibly. As a 4-wing 3.
Yes, the Enneagram, hello.
Both to be different and to impress.
Yeah.
But I read Lord of the Rings when I was 12 or 13. And because I thought, like, this is this is one of those big important books that you read, and after I finish this one, I'm going to go find the next, big important classic that you're supposed to have read.
Yeah.
And I don't bother with that anymore. There are a lot of books that are on those lists of like classics that you quote unquote should read. But if I don't find them interesting, I just don't bother these days. So I think I've let go this idea that there is some sort of hierarchy of what is, I don't know,
what should be read.
Important literature. Also because a lot of those books that were more classics, they were, especially in science fiction, there was a lot of science fiction and fantasy, quote unquote, classics that were written by old white men who I didn't find very compelling. And like I read this one series of books. There's 14 books in the series, and I read the first 10 of them, and none of the books have less than 600 pages. And every single female character in that giant world that he made was manipulative and power hungry and never had a single like genuinely friendly conversation with another woman. And I was, after reading 10 of these books, I was like, you know what? I think this just isn't realistic. I'm like, I have plenty of, like, even if I were trying to be the very best at everything, I could still manage to have nice conversations with the other people around me. I don't think that I need to spend my time reading these books anymore. So
yeah, this is interesting. Like I'm on holiday this week, so I've took 5 or 6 books in the library, in the bibliothèque, and like one of them, I took the number 2 and I never read the number 1. It's a 2-book series, and I was like, that's fine. It's a teenage book, and like the couple that is in the book, I was like, this is not, I mean, the woman keeps lying to the guy because she has issues, and the guy is like, I love you, talk to me. And I'm like, this is not real life. I mean, this is not how we should have teenage girls or even boys picture a romantic relationship. This is not helpful. And I was like, yeah, and all this mushy love scene, like not love scene, but like a love declaration. And this is, I can't really stand that anymore because I know this is not real life.
And I think there's also a difference sometimes between things that are, like, I love reading stories where there's complex and healthy relationships between characters. Yeah. And I like that kind of a cast of characters that where you have a whole group that have different various friendships and relationships within them. And I can understand it is realistic sometimes to have broken relationships or to have have, fights and things, but you need to understand the motivations, and as a writer you need to present those motivations and give us a good reason why we should believe that this person is mad at that person. And I don't know, I prefer if there's some hope for those relationships to become better and not just nope, everybody's manipulative and trying to stab each other in the back all the time.
I wonder what Freud would have to say about how this guy wrote about women. Anyway, this is okay. So now you're being more thoughtful on how characters are portrayed in the books you're reading. And it makes sense because you're an adult, so you have more ability to like have a cognitive and recognize the bias that maybe you're presented in the books you're reading. Nice. Is there any way it changed also your reading?
That my reading changed, or that something changed my
is there other no, sorry. I was like, pretty sure the words are not in the right sentence, but maybe she will get the question. Okay.
Are there other ways that my reading has changed since I was a kid?
Yes.
I don't hate romance anymore, I think.
Oh,
I still
yeah.
won't read a book that's only romance because ick.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Yeah. Yeah, it kind of has to have a story as well, not just
Yeah.
love.
I also used to hate that, and maybe this is also a growth in understanding other people through books. But I used to think, like, all these love stories, especially between teenagers, like, they're not realistic at all. I'm a
Yeah,
teenager.
yeah,
I'm not like falling head over heels for every other, human male that walks past
yeah,
my vicinity. This just isn't realistic. And now that I'm older, I realize, there are some people for whom that's a thing, and there are some people
yeah.
for whom it's not. And so I should also, on the flip side, not assume that just because somebody is a teenager experiencing love, that it's fake.
Yeah,
So
no, that's true. That's true. I mean, like, yeah, yeah, it's true. Yeah, but maybe the issue is, like you said at the beginning, if it's simplistic, it's like I feel like the most teenagers are either represented as like they don't care about boys, or they care way too much about boys, and like there's no middle ground for most book. Like they are not like either they're way too obsessed, or they are like, or they have issues that prevent them from liking boys, and it's like, well, life is more complex than these two extremes. So yeah.
yeah.
And so you do you have any specific books that influence your teenage years, and why?
So books that influenced my teenage years
Mm-hmm.
were, well, I read Lord of the Rings early on,
Yeah,
when I was a preteen still,
yeah,
and I got so obsessed because it was so cool, and it wasn't just a kids thing like the Chronicles of Narnia was. It was like these were adults, and these were like, I don't know, and the movies were coming out at the same time. So then I got all of these figurines, and I was making up my own fan fiction.
wow,
I was
so cool.
very I was very obsessed. And then that phase kind of passed, and I decided,
Yeah,
I can't ever get that obsessed about something again. Like, I just can't. It's too much.
like why? Because people think you're weird, or because
No,
it's too
because
much for
I
you?
realized that I was putting so much effort into, like, I legitimately wanted my first foreign language to be Elvish for a while.
Okay, I see.
I was
Okay,
like
too much.
trying to
Yeah.
figure out how can I learn Elvish and Dwarvish.
Do you have any school in the US where you can learn
No, I don't.
Klingon?
Oh, no, but you can learn it on Duolingo.
I love this. And Elvish as well?
I don't think Elvish is on there. Because I don't know if Tolkien ever like passed it on in a way that other people could learn it. Because he invented the whole
And
language, but he also, I
yeah,
don't know if he like made up a dictionary or anything.
and
But
oh, this is great.
anyway,
I love this to know this about you that you wanted to. And so like you learn some sentences.
no, I didn't. I learned because
Oh,
in the back of my Return of the King book, there was a tiny dictionary of just a few word stems, but there wasn't any
yeah.
explanation of grammar or full sentences. I may have memorized some of the sentences in the movie, like
Yeah.
Naga Daga
Oh, we need
Fire,
to watch the
they are
movie.
going to die, Aragorn.
We need to watch this movie together. This is amazing.
Okay, Lord of the Rings is an example of how my reading has changed from when
Yeah,
I was a teenager because
yeah,
and even watching the movie, because now as an adult I'm able to watch it and see just how much Lord of the Rings is a product of Tolkien and his era,
yeah,
and how he has this whole nostalgia for a world that is passing, and for the heroicism of battle and war and honor and all of those things that reflects very much the fact that he lived through 2 world wars and fought in one of them, and that the world was changing and there was all this modernization, And so it's very much a product of who he is. And so I can still, even though now that I'm watching it, I realize there are some problematic things about it, like the fact that there are 3 women in the whole cast, and only one of them has an interesting story arc.
Yeah.
And the fact that there are the representation of people of color in the book and in the movie is also not very favorable, because the only, people of color, the Southerners who side with Sauron, and there's the wild men who are seen as, who appear in like one scene in the book and don't make it into the movie, and like his conceptualization of the other in that sense wasn't very nuanced.
Yeah.
And so I can still watch it and enjoy it while holding those things in my mind and saying, it's nice. It's cool. There's some good values in here. There's an amazing soundtrack. But at the same time, it's not perfect. At the same time, I would like to watch more fantasy that has women who are central and nuanced, and that has more diversity, and that doesn't have this kind of looking down on people of a different, lesser culture, that doesn't have this great grand history and literal ivory towers.
Yeah.
So holding those things in tension as I watch it, my appreciation of it, and also understanding that there's legitimate critique of it, is something that has changed.
That's a really good example, like on how a book is shaping you and how you view the world unconsciously. Because I never thought of all those things with The Lord of the Rings, but now you're sharing them. I can't ever unsee this or unthink this. And you're no, but I mean, it's great because this is shaping how I view the world and how I view the other without me knowing it. And so that can be dangerous. And so thanks. I can now think back on this, and I can now be aware of this when I read it or when I watch the movies.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing.
And that goes back to that, in general, the concept of the other is the reminder that we need to constantly ask the question of, oh wait, who's not here? Wait, who's not being represented? And it's not that every book should represent every person or every story, because you can't do that. It's too much. But the ones that you include, make sure that you're thinking, how do I make this a complex and honoring to people who might feel represented by this character? Or,
Great. Wow, that was deep. So do you have a final thought you want to share on reading The Other?
Yeah, something my younger sister has said a couple times to me is that she's trying to remind herself that everyone is the main character of their own story. And that when we're interacting with others, we need to try and view other people as being as complex as we are, and to listen humbly to other people's stories.
This is interesting and deep and wow, yeah. This is and for me, who is so centered around me, I mean, I think that's a human trait. So for humans who are so centered around themselves, like I am, this is hard to say that people are their hero in their own story, and not just a second character in my story.
Exactly.
I will say it in French, maybe you can help me. On est tous le personnage secondaire de quelqu'un.
That we're all a secondary character in somebody else's story.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
So thanks, Katie.
Thank you so much
for being my first English host, and thanks for all your great thoughts.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that was great.